And as we look to the future, I think that given the events of the last couple of years, we've sort of honed in on two or three areas that we think will be very important. So the first one is obviously supply chain sustainability. But then also what comes into that for us is agri-tech security, or like food security for the region. And then sort of slightly lesser in terms of security, but energy scarcity and sort of building a more sustainable future.
Sacha Haider is the youngest partner of a VC firm in the MENA region, leading the investment team at Global Ventures, which was established in Dubai in 2018 and backs growth stage and tech-focused founders in emerging markets around the world, with a ticket size of around $3 million or less. So far, the firm has deployed more than $100 million across more than 40 companies. On average, the team of 27 people across 7 geographies and 17 nationalities screens around 250 companies monthly. Sacha, I took that from the Forbes 30 Under 30 write-up for you from last year. Congratulations on being included on that list. So you at Global Ventures actually invest in emerging markets and are really focused on increasing access to digital services, digital goods. And you have a bit of a investment thesis that there's a huge opportunity to leapfrog legacy supply chain systems in developing markets. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for the acknowledgement. I really appreciate that. In terms of sort of supply chains as the focus, maybe I'll take a quick step back. So I think that we're a sector agnostic VC firm. So, I would not pretend to be an expert in any subject, but usually each of our, every so often we have a think around what are going to be some of the most important issues of the next 5 to 10 years, or what will sort of be the underpinning technology. So at the birth of our first fund in 2018, it was really fintech, because we saw that as layer one of all innovation. For our second fund, and this was sort of just before the pandemic, we saw health tech as sort of or healthcare, I guess, as a sector for big disruption. So a significant portion of our second fund was invested there. And as we look to the future, I think that given the events of the last couple of years, we've sort of honed in on two or three areas that we think will be very important. So the first one is obviously supply chain sustainability. But then also what comes into that for us is agri-tech security, or like food security for the region. And then sort of slightly lesser in terms of security, but energy scarcity and sort of building a more sustainable future. So I think that supply chain fits into this wider thesis or thought that we're having, that the next 5 years sustainability of food, energy, and sort of supply chain, how we get and receive goods, is sort of the bigger picture thesis.
How we get and receive goods was something I don't think many people thought of until about 3 years ago, when suddenly it became kind of one of the foremost thoughts to most of us. And then the supply chain, the amount of disruption that it felt during the pandemic now seems like it just will never recede. We've got war in Ukraine, inflationary pressures, China reopening. There's all of these kind of dynamics in play that make it seem like the supply chain, which we took for granted, it felt like, before the pandemic, is now something that's no longer a given. And we actually are interested in disrupting the supply chain, implementing tech into the supply chain. Like, describe to me how you guys are actually looking at this issue. Maybe even just for the listener, define, what all goes into actually getting that package to your doorstep, which is just one aspect of the supply chain. But
yeah.
Sure. Break down the segments of the supply chain for someone like you who's looking at it from an investor perspective. Where are the points?
Yeah, for sure. So I think I'll just double down on what you said. I think we live in a world of instant gratification, where people want, whatever it is that they see online immediately. And I think it's becoming more and more of a reality that we can get goods delivered to our doorstep the next day, whether it's Amazon Prime or, this under 24-hour delivery. But I think most people, to your point, and despite what's happened in the last couple of years, would really have a tough time understanding where things have come from and how they've sort of reached them. And one of the numbers that really astounded me, or things I thought about, as we were pulling together this research, was 100 years ago, or less than 100 years ago, there were 200 individual items in the average supermarket. We now live in a day and age where there are 40,000 different SKUs in any given supermarket, right? So I think, we've seen this exponential growth around consumption more than anything, where people are used to, regardless of the time of year, are used to having their shelves stocked with, fruits that are out of season, and couldn't be grown where they are, or things that come from the furthest corners of the world. And we reference that in our report, the pink salt from the Himalayas or berries from the US. And actually, there's something quite inherently unsustainable about that, but it's just really the way that we consume right now. But in terms of how we think about supply chain, or how we break it down, is we really look at it as the journey of a product, starting really at the point of manufacturing, which is how a good gets made, the raw materials that go into it, and then sort of the journey from the factory to port, whether that's an airport or a seaport. And then, we kind of call that the first mile, or whether that's on land, by air, sort of how it gets to the middle mile, which is where you have these distribution centers and things are then broken down, into smaller packages and then sent on to the last mile, which are then these providers who then get it finally to the end consumer. So really the way we think about supply chain is like, as something is made or grown, how does it get from the point of origination all the way into the consumer's hand? And then sort of across that, we have this, we see enablers that run across the entire value chain. So the different types of technology, whether that's financing technology that can be used across the value chain, or whether that's, different types of drones, et cetera, that could be used at different points of the value chain as well. So yeah, we think about it as the journey of a product.
And my understanding is that the supply chain, the way it's been managed to date, has been fairly old-fashioned, fairly analog. There's not been a whole lot of modernization. I mean, except for what is often, I think, we've seen plenty of commercials about logistics. If you've ever seen a FedEx or UPS commercial, how happy logistics are, and Amazon warehouses that are there's as many robots as there are humans in those fulfillment centers. There's a sense that it's being modernized, but then also once you start confronting all of these delays, there's also a sense that this is a very old, very stodgy industry that's really ripe for some tech. So what is your sense of that?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that one of the things that we underestimate sometimes is how complex supply chains are. So, I mean, just given what's happened in the last sort of 30 to 40 years, and like the increasing globalization and the drive to push down costs, there's different centers of productions for different pieces of different products that then have to come together in a certain place, be assembled. And then, there's consumers all over the world, and there's, multiple middlemen, and there's a huge amount of inefficiencies. A product might sit at a port for a few days before it even moves anywhere to the next point. So it's inherently very, very complex, and that's why it's been quite difficult to modernize it. Secondly, there's this large amount of physical infrastructure that most of the incumbents have. So to the names you mentioned, like the DHLs and the FedExes, and for new players, it's very difficult for them to try and recreate that type of physical infrastructure. So we are largely dependent on some of those incumbents making changes to how things are done. And then I was shocked to find, one of the statistics that I heard that I was really shocked to find was 50% of large freight companies use Excel sheets to manage their operations. So I think that, the whole saying that if it's not broken, why fix it? There's very little digitization, although we are seeing an increasing shift towards it. So yeah, it's very ripe for disruption. I think that the, COVID-19 pandemic highlighted that, there was $4 trillion in revenue loss due to supply chain breakdown, that, that this is a real problem. And I think that we're seeing an opportunity for technology to sort of come in around the incumbents and existing physical infrastructure and make some serious improvements.
You referenced earlier just how globalized our supply chain and our global economy is, but there's been kind of a backlash to that following the pandemic. And there's a bit of a resurgence around localization and this new buzzword I'm seeing pop up more and more, deglobalization. Can you talk about localization and deglobalization and how that fits into the future supply chain, how supply chains might actually look different going forward if we kind of, stop celebrating globalization so much and then instead emphasize localization a bit more?
Yeah. So I actually don't think the two things have to be entirely mutually exclusive. Like, I'm inherently a globalist, and I actually think it's a good thing that supply chains are somewhat globalized, and that we do rely on various parts of the world for various goods and services. I think it fosters better cooperation for us as countries, and brings us closer together. At the same time, I think that there's obviously an inherent risk around relying on different parts of different goods and services to come from each part of the world. So I think that the next sort of 5 to 10 years and the push towards localization will be more around building the ability and the know-how and the optionality around different sources for a supply chain. So you could procure a good or service from China, or with 3D printing, you could locally print the input that you're looking for the manufacturing process as well, right? So I think it's more around building that know-how, using technology to bridge the gap, and then sort of de-risking by having alternative sources in the supply chain. And that's really where I see the opportunity for localization. I think that there are still obviously sort of economies of scale to producing certain goods and services at scale in different markets and having them shipped across. But it's really about de-risking in terms of building in that optionality in the supply chain and having sort of multiple sources for certain goods, so that if there's a disruption at one point in the supply chain or with one provider, that you could then have alternative sources for the same good.
I'm wondering what school of thought you ascribe to. I'm seeing sort of a tale of two consumers emerging. There's one consumer who's very conscious of the environment and really wants a lot of visibility and transparency into the supply chain, and even knows what a supply chain is. And then there's another consumer, the one I think that we talked about at the top of this, which is, they expect their shipment in 24 hours or less. They really don't know how it got there. It's just this magical thing that happens. And it's the thing that's now filling landfills. There's just a massive amount of waste in our kind of always consuming culture. And so there's two schools of thought, it seems, that are emerging. That there's one, consumers expect what they want when they want it in less than 24 hours. And then there's another, which is consumers are becoming more nuanced and more versed in, eco kind of consuming. Which one do you buy into? Which one are you paying attention to? Which one do you think will actually drive markets in the next 5 to 10 years?
So I'm going to give you a really annoying answer to this one, because I really think it's somewhere between the two.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's both. And it's both because I think that, one of the challenges that we've experienced in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, or even longer than that, is it's not necessarily a challenge of, if you receive something tomorrow, then it is unsustainable. I think that the instant gratification piece and where goods and services come from, and building better traceability and understanding of how we obtain goods and services is very important. But a lot of the reason that we haven't received goods and services in a timely manner historically, or through our supply chain, is because there's a lack of operational excellence, or there's a lack of data visibility, or there's a lack of different sort of management softwares being able to communicate with each other. And I see really, we can, I see an opportunity for technology to bridge the gap there, right? So I think I alluded to it earlier, but, in a supply chain, there's fundamentally many different middlemen as it stands. There's multiple hands and, involved in the passing of a good through to the consumer. And a lot of the time, there's very poor data visibility and understanding of, information around where that good is right now and how it's going to get to the next person. And that's like a small space where, technology can bridge the gap by, building a bit more traceability and understanding where a good is, whether that's like, IoT devices that are, able to track software, or API integrations, which allow different softwares to speak to each other depending on who the providers are. I think that, we could build more operational excellence to drive a faster and more seamless consumer experience, right? I think that the eco-sustainable part of the conversation is the way that we have obtained goods and services historically. And I think that there are some large fast fashion brands which are, famously known for this, is around how we consume and the core materials that go into the goods and services that we wear. And then the modes of manufacturing, are those sustainable? Is there child labor involved? And I think that, you can have operational excellence and have a better consumer experience, but you can also, have a good understanding of where your goods come from. And that, I think, relies a little bit more in the interim on the conscious consumer, and the regulator, who's, I guess, a bit more tough on people who sort of flaunt the rules. And then the consumer experience piece is really up to the private sector, the providers of the supply chain experience, I guess.
I want to talk a bit more about actually just getting what actually is being delivered when we talk about we're talking really about e-commerce as part of the supply chain right now, and um, your expertise area really is in sub-Saharan Africa, and you've looked at just getting food and pharmaceuticals, just the basics. I think when we talk about instant gratification and consumer want, we're not really talking about we're not necessarily talking about just material wants. We're talking about basic necessities. So how can emerging markets, how can the MENA region, you know, be a forward mover, like be a first mover on improving supply chain to just get essential goods and services to those who most need it? How can emerging markets actually leapfrog where a lot of this is failing them already? They're not getting the food and pharmaceuticals that they actually need right now.
Yeah, so we focus on the Middle East, Africa, and what's really interesting is like obviously we have the GCC within that and the UAE, which is a very developed country with great infrastructure, and then on the other hand, we look at markets like Egypt and Nigeria, where there's like a more significant gap in terms of infrastructure, right? And if you think about Africa for a minute, or think about sub-Saharan Africa, one of our portfolio companies, Remedial Health, tackles pharmaceutical supply chain in that market and is essentially servicing the tier 2 and tier 3 city pharmacies, which are the mom and pop shops that have like a few SKUs and are the community pharmacy, right? And that's like that's a very fundamental need in those markets. And I think the challenges there historically have been that it's very fragmented. So there's multiple players, and I think for the average pharmacist, they have to go to multiple different sources to procure the medicine they need. So anything that's able to sort of centralize that and bring that together solves the problem in a really significant way. And sort of on top of that, given that there's like a gap in infrastructure within those markets, there's a real opportunity for tech to bridge that gap, but then also to start doing things in a new way without having to overcome any legacy or previous existing systems, or have to work the same way with the incumbents like the large freight forwarders, etc., like you would maybe in more developed markets. Like there's a lot of vested interest. Conversely, and I think we discussed about the problems that we have across our markets, certain things as vitamins and other things as painkillers. And then in sub-Saharan Africa, and then even North Africa to a significant extent, we see things more as painkillers rather than vitamins. But there's still, it's also worth noting that there is obviously growing e-commerce on the continent as well. And that is driving a lot of the improvements in supply chain and the logistics infrastructure there as well. On the other hand, we have the UAE and the GCC, where we have, as I mentioned, the sort of fundamentally much stronger infrastructure, the presence of the large incumbents in quite a significant way, much higher GDP per capita, and the higher disposable income, and higher e-commerce penetration to a certain extent, right? And with that in mind, we also have a very, very friendly regulator who's willing to adopt certain technologies. Like we've had really interesting conversations with drone companies in the region, and we really see, given the vision for the UAE and Saudi, how these things could become a reality in these markets really soon. So I think that in these markets we have the opportunity, and the opportunity is there to really adopt some of the newer technology, just given the presence of a friendly regulator and a very very digitally savvy consumer as
When
well.
are we getting drone deliveries in the UAE? Do you have any insight on that?
I don't have a specific date, but I definitely see the region as being one of the early adopters. I don't think it's too far away
This year,
in the future.
next year.
I wouldn't be able to tell you.
All right, but I do want to talk a little bit more about the UAE. They have Operation 300 Billion, the Made in the UAE initiative. There's kind of a range of initiatives at the public policy level, at the federal investment level, to really push localization and becoming more of a logistics hub. Can you speak a little bit to that? What opportunities are right here in our backyard, and how does that open up opportunities for you guys?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that we the UAE has always been a hub. I don't think that's something new. I think
Right.
if you look at us on a map, and if you think about it, takes us 6 hours to get to any given place we'd like to go. We have some of the most direct flights, right, in terms of air cargo. And we've seen, that the UAE is a bulk-breaking place for goods goods that come from China to Africa, and can really be the sort of center point, in terms of like this global trade network. So geographically, actually, we're placed very well,
Right. The UAE
to
has
do
long
that.
been a center point, but it's not been an originator for very long. There's
Yes.
very little that's made and shipped from here. A lot comes here and then goes back out in different formats. But
Yeah.
the ambition really is to be an originator. Can you speak to that ambition?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, historically, we've not really produced much in this part of the world, and I mean that's not a secret. But I think increasingly, as more and more technical talent comes to the region, as there's more adoption of technology, there's really an opportunity, just given sort of one, where we're geographically placed, but then also the sort of innovation hub that the UAE is becoming, for us to adopt some of the additive manufacturing technologies, in this part of the world, and build sort of a manufacturing hub around certain verticals in the region as well. But I think that it's two things. So I think that historically we've always been perhaps not a point of origination, and we've been this hub. But I think that the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see the region double down on this hub, or this like center point for trade as well. So I think that there's going to be a more concentrated effort towards building that trade corridor between the UAE and Africa, and I think equally towards other bits of Asia as well. Just sort of reinforcing our sort of role or place in central supply chains. And then obviously, where local manufacturing has an edge, it would definitely make sense for the UAE to become a manufacturing hub.
All right. Before we end, I just want to ask you about a career in VC. You're one of our younger guests that we've spoken to in recent memory. And I just want, for listeners who are thinking about a career in maybe venture capital, particularly in this region, what advice do you have?
I mean, this is an amazing job. I think I kind of alluded to it. Like, you get to learn about different things every single day, and get to sort of spend time with experts, in different fields, and learn about and think about the future and what that's going to look like. The one piece of advice I would say, and I think this is stuck with me, and it's actually the only requirement that I have when I hire somebody, is that be curious. So always be willing to ask questions, always be willing to try and understand why things the way they are. And I think that will serve you really well, because there's lots that we don't know, and I'm reminded that every day doing this job. But I feel like I find being curious really helps, because if you're willing to find out the answer, I think it can take you very far.
Sacha Haider of Global Ventures, thanks for talking to me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe wherever you get your audio content. All that's left is to thank our production team and you for listening.